Greetings, listeners. This is author H. Melvin James. I will be reading a brief excerpt from my novel, Tares Among the Wheat, a literary fiction novel in 2 volumes. As a tractor-trailer driver, Brian was often on the road, far from home. Having the joy of her baby son Stuart, a caring neighbor, the widow Mrs. Woodward, and her dear affectionate friend Beatrice, Amy managed to endure her husband being away, often several days at a time, even as she struggled to overcome the grief of her mother's recent death. While Brian was away, he was certain to telephone each evening. At home, Brian spent every of his waking moments enjoying the company of his wife and their baby boy. As Brian was a model of the American blue-collar worker and husband, Amy was the ideal devoted wife and mother. But that contemporary storybook life, modest as it was rich, was once again abruptly altered. Along a nondescript expanse of distant highway, tangent to a curve in an ice-glazed turnpike in central Pennsylvania, on a sub-freezing February night, Brian died. His lifeblood drained into the crevices of the crumpled cab of his tractor truck, while passerby, would-be rescuers, worked frantically to free his twisted body from pinching and piercing steel. Early the next morning, Amy opened her front door to a local police sergeant. The determined knocking had summoned Amy from the kitchen. Approaching the front door, she saw the golden morning sunlight flooding the porch and streaming through every east-facing window. Although certainly chilly, she believed it would be a marvelous, long-awaited bright day after weeks of overcast skies, fog, sleet, rain, and drizzle. Through the collage of small beveled glass panes, she discerned the twinkling of brass buttons and the shining badge, all in contrast against the blue uniform. As she crossed the parlor floor, Amy wondered if a neighborhood child was missing, or if a gas pipeline had sprung a leak, or perhaps an escaped convict was in the vicinity. Amy opened the door, sporting a welcoming smile. It was in Amy's nature to expect that every person she met would delight her with flattery, fascinating tales, or, as equally delightful, simply their interesting character. Since kindergarten, Amy's expectations had been repeatedly reinforced, somewhat owing to the inheritance of her mother's optimism, but more so due to her tranquilizing beauty and her exuberant glee, enticing everyone she met to react with compliments. But as she looked into the officer's face, even before his opening mouth spoke, her smile melted away like a thin slice of butter in a heated cooking pan. Amy was panic-stricken as soon as the policeman spoke. "Mrs. Brian Meade?" Her eyes frantically scanned his face for contradictory evidence of his purpose, but her obstinate intuition had already disclosed the tragedy. In those moments, Amy's mind begged her senses for any sign of hope, any measure of doubt, thread of a mistake, or so much as a hint that it was but a cruel, mean joke, anything but the horrible truth. Of that confused encounter, Amy would only remember seeing the messenger's lips move without producing sound. She would recall that his eyes never quite met with hers. She would not consciously recall a single word he spoke. Countless replays of that moment haunted Amy in the days and weeks following the tragedy. In hellish torture, she was forced to relive the scene again and again, as if it were a dreary rehearsal of her paltry part in a stage play, one she repeatedly bungled and had to redo again and again, but could never get right. She paced through the portrayal in daydreams that froze her in trance, and in nightmares of fitful thrashing in her lonely bed. For weeks she entertained insane thoughts, that if she had simply not answered the door, then the angel of death would have had no choice but to reverse time, spare her husband, and reappoint the tragedy to some other man's wife, perhaps half a world away. While the policeman stood awkwardly at attention, Amy closed the door on him without uttering a word. Subconsciously, her wounded mind reasoned, whatever form of evil or insanity was lurching at the doorstep, it can be avoided by simply closing the door, forbidding it to enter, and denying its interference in her life. Indeed, her mind contrived, unless there is acknowledgement and until there is acceptance, fate is foiled from trespassing upon reality. Amy even imagined she would soon awaken from a nightmare and then be in euphoric gratitude to the Lord to find the horror had only been dreamt. Denying a truth she feared her heart could not withstand, Amy had closed the door in the policeman's face and turned back to continue her housework as if the interruption was as trivial as a mistaken house address. Outwardly, Amy appeared dazed, but on the inside her mind wrestled frantically with madness, and her heart convulsed, thrashing within her chest like a wildcat trapped in a gunny sack. She had never before realized that her being was not a single entity, but a collection of several autonomous characters. Those disparate components were usually congruent, and when anyone was not, that entity usually remained reticent. But now each of those characters, antagonists answering to such names as reason, conscience, hope, fear, and faith, were quarreling violently, trying her soul. As Amy began to cross the floor to the kitchen, the distance seemed to expand. Baby Stuart, sitting in his booster seat and stirring his oatmeal, seemed to be floating away from her on a rolling sea. Eventually reaching the kitchen threshold, anxiety and dizziness overcame her. Clutching the door frame, she sank to the floor, bawling profusely and slapping the linoleum with the palms of her hands. The strange and frightening behavior of his mother sent Stuart into frantic wailing. Soon the infant's screams triggered a maternal instinct, bringing the young mother back to a semblance of normalcy, even while persisting in avoiding the solemn reality of her transfigured world. This has been a reading from Volume 1 of my novel, Tares Among the Wheat. Periodically I will read other brief excerpts from my novel and post them on my website, h-melvin-james.com. Thank you for your interest. This is H. Melvin James, bidding fare thee well.